Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I've got a bit of a Riot grab bag here to talk about, as Riot have put out a ton of red post content just today, it feels like. So going to be going through and breaking down a lot of these posts and talking about kind of my thoughts on all the things that Riot have been talking about most recently. Now, the first thing, of course, here is the Lolpls that Riot put out earlier today. Now, it was formerly Riot Please, but since Riot now has more than one game, they have changed it to Lolpls instead. Does that mean we may get a Valorant Please or a TFT Please in the future? Maybe so, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what that actually ends up doing. But either way, generally, Riot gave a breakdown on where they feel like the game is currently at and what they think that their focus can be for the future going forward, or what their focus was like over the last couple of months. Now, first and foremost, they talked about the new item system they developed, and they said they liked it as a system for delivering unique choices and diversity in build paths to every champion in the game. And I do find myself generally agreeing on this point. I find myself building mythic items based on the situation or the enemy team comp, and items themselves have a lot more of a what feels good at the moment feel to them, rather than being confined to very gluey build paths. I feel like, you know, in the old system, it really did feel like you kind of built the same first couple of items in every single game, right? Like, that's just kind of how you did it, because there wasn't much of a reason to really change up your build in a meaningful way. Whereas in the new system, it really kind of does feel like, yeah, okay, even if you go the same mythic in most of your games, there will be times where you want to flex it up. And then from there, you kind of do look at the enemy team composition and say, okay, what tools do I actually want, or what tools do I actually need in this particular situation? In fact, just last night I was playing a couple of 1v1s with a close friend of mine, and it really wasn't, you know, just build the same items every game. It really was more of a what tools am I specifically looking for, and can I specifically buy here? So I do really kind of like where that's at in the system, and I think that Riot have done a good job of setting that up. However, obviously, it's not completely ideal. We're not living in Magical Christmas Land quite yet. Some options are very mandatory or just very good because they bring just super good stat lines for the particular class or particular champion in mind. Gore Drinker obviously is just an amazing fighter item because of how much sustain it gives across the board, and it's very good build path. And Stride Breaker is obviously like a must-buy on very low mobility champions like Garen and Darius. And these sort of situations, it's sort of hard to see why these champions would want to diversify their build path when these items essentially give them everything they want. That being said, I don't think it's sort of an impossible situation to be in. I just feel like Riot will need to find ways to either make other options more enticing, or make the current options somewhat less enticing, so you want to build them less, maybe by shifting around mythic passives, or otherwise affecting what the items themselves do. Along those lines, I do want to talk a little bit about the items that they think are having problems in the first place. They specifically call out Sunfire Aegis, and I think the biggest problem here is that it is a very specific, it is a very generic sort of item to have. It really is sort of a, okay, yeah, you're going to build this because the niche for Sunfire Aegis is just damage, right? You build this because you want to do damage, and there's not really more of a niche to have it, whereas Frostfire Gauntlet, for example, is being able to stick to targets is sort of its niche, and Turbo Chem Tank is initiation, right? Being able to run down champions. Those are very specific situations that you can kind of math out and look at for yourself by saying, okay, the enemy team, you know, they really have issues, you know, we have issues with actually engaging on them and getting to them, so that's a Chem Tank game. Or Frostfire Gauntlet is going to be a game where you have the tools to get onto them, but they're very slippery after the fact, right? Whereas Sunfire Aegis doesn't have that. It's just sort of, I bought this because I want more damage. So would love to see that niche in particular slide and be a little bit less obvious and a little bit less generic. Additionally, I would love to see these support options be a little less generic as well. I mean, right now it feels like Moonstone Renewer is the healer option and Locket of the Iron Solari is the tank option, and I would love to feel to see them be a little bit more generic, because I do feel like there are situations where even on a champion like Yuumi, where you could see, for example, you know, maybe a place where you would want to build something like the Locket of the Iron Solari to help your team survive burst, or you want to build the Shirelia's Reverie because you want to be able to accelerate your team into a team fight or reposition away from enemies who are trying to hard engage. You know, that's kind of a thing. The biggest problem I have, though, is because of the stats those items provide, and because of the mythic passives in particular that they provide, it's sort of hard to see yourself building either of these items anyways. So what I would love to see Riot do is go back to a couple of these items and sort of find ways to make them feel better on particular champions, and find situations where they feel okay to build whether you're tank or whether you're a healer, and that way you sort of do open up those build paths for enchanters in particular. I think are the biggest ones that are having problems, because tanky supports can kind of dip into the tank pool, but you kind of see what I'm getting at in that regard. In addition, Riot do call out mage itemization. I've talked a little bit before about Liandry's Anguish, but definitely it's the biggest problem, I would say, in mage itemization, in that it's just too generically good. The champions that want it really do want it, and there's just sort of very few situations, I feel like, where you don't want to build it if you are a DP or a dot champion. And in a similar regard, Luden's Tempest is just kind of the generically good item, right? There are very few situations where I feel like you don't want to build it if you are the kind of champion that gets value off of it. You know, it's just kind of like, okay, yeah, you just buy this, as opposed to having sort of options generalized across the board. I would honestly love to see if Luden's Tempest was either turned into the burst item, but then maybe it would trespass in Night Harvester, so maybe you instead focus on the movement speed aspect and less on the upfront burst damage, right? I feel like there are just ways to kind of tweak it around and get it into a situation better where you're able to have fewer generic options, or, you know, more generic options, but it also, you're building them based on what stats you specifically want. Riot also talked a little bit about new legendary items, which is super exciting for me. I'm a little concerned with Riot giving enchanters an item to counteract dive-heavy comps, but I guess Locket existed before in the old system that enchanters could build, so it's probably not too bad. They also talked about a legendary item to counter split push, and that's the one I'm concerned about because we all remember, or maybe we don't all remember, but we remember the Banner of Command meta or the Zerat Portal meta where you're able to build these items and they're either obscenely bad, like actually you're trolling if you build them, or they're just hilariously overpowered and you're able to just kind of insta-win the game by playing the PvE setup as opposed to actually having to interact with your opponents at all. There's also nothing, at the moment at least, to prevent Riot from or to prevent sort of split pushers from building these anti-split push items and therefore being able to split push even better. So we'll have to see what Riot have come up with. Obviously, they did remove Banner of Command and Zerat Portal in the first place because they weren't happy with where those items were at. So I would love to see how they take a second approach at the sort of split push items and how they're going to handle, especially tanks being able to deal champions like Fiora who just want to kind of sit in a side lane and split push forever. They also talk a little bit about Burst is next up on Riot's menu here. I feel like Burst is still fairly high even after the changes they've made. And in general, I feel like League plays better with lower burst damage overall. So even if Riot are okay with where it's currently at, I do feel like generally speaking, there could stand to be less burst in the game because having less burst gives you more opportunity to play front-to-back teamfight compositions. It gives enemy teams more time to fight back from sort of maybe slightly less than perfect initiations. Obviously, if you initiate perfectly and sort of perfectly wombo your damage, like, you should win that. And I'm not saying, you know, those are situations where you shouldn't just obliterate the enemy team, but if you're not able to get that perfect initiation, if you kind of sort of have these, you know, meandering, okay, we got a couple of people and the fight's sort of stringing out, those are kind of where I like League of Legends at its most because it does give you a situation where you have these very back and forth team fights and the potential for outplay, which I do really like, and I do think that's a situation that Riot should try to strive for, even if they're okay with where Burst is currently at. In a similar fashion, systemic healing is definitely overtuned, and that's sort of the goal behind the current changes that Riot are putting onto the PvE. I know I just talked about Ravenous Hunter and all the changes Riot were making, and at this point, maybe it should be removed, but I definitely feel like Riot could try to put healing more into champion kits rather than in the systemic healing, because I feel like that's sort of the biggest issue is any champion being able to opt into the healing, as opposed to specifically a champion being able to say, I heal a lot, and therefore items like Executioner's Calling are good specifically against me, as opposed to general situations where any champion can buy so much healing that you feel like you need an Executioner's Calling. I would love to see if maybe Riot could take an effort to fix it by tying healing into things like AD or AP. Building that scales up the amount of healing you get more than just, you know, you auto attack, your auto attacks do more damage, therefore you heal more for them, and instead into a sort of situation where it's your auto attacks are doing more damage so you heal more, but also the actual healing values are scaling based on your attack damage. That would maybe be an interesting thing, or adding a healing stat that scales up the amount of healing you receive from all sources, similar to how Riot have given us the bonus healing and shielding power stat for supports, which still hasn't been keyworded, but either way, that sort of a thing, that could be an interesting way to maybe get it into a more systemically viable state. Finally, Riot did go ahead and talk about snowballing. And now, I do want to preface this first by saying snowballing is not necessarily a bad thing. If you have an advantage in the game, you should be able to use that advantage to win games faster. That's not a problem. That's sort of how the game works, especially given that if the game didn't have snowballs, then you would have every game be 40 to 50 minute slugfest because taking risks wouldn't be worth it. Enemy teams would just kind of sit around and both farm and both know that they'd be able to reach their maximum power because it's impossible to ever snowball a lead into a win. In fact, you even have games like Dota's Heroes of the Storm, sorry, not Dota, Heroes of the Storm, where you have situations where it just sort of doesn't matter because they don't have things like the item system, where you can't really snowball a lead because there is no way to gain a massive advantage over enemy teams by playing well early game. Pretty much every game is going to go late because you don't have a way of really snowballing up on the enemy. So that's why snowballing is a good thing. That being said, Riot are still saying that they want to be looking into catch-up mechanics for the next preseason, which I do think I like. I want to have Riot get the game into a state where snowballing is still a viable way to win a game, but also that it doesn't just dictate a game, right? Where you're able to get into a spot where, sure, if you fall behind, there are very clear and obvious routes you can take to coming back in a game. I know before Riot have done things like giving champions bonus XP for champions that are behind, or if they've done things like junglers getting more gold for camps if they're behind their enemy jungler. Like, I would love to see those kind of changes come through, because those are the sort of things that I do believe will help champions come back into games that they may be losing as is. So definitely looking forward to see what Riot do, but that is, of course, going to be next preseason, so that's going to be a ways out, unfortunately. Riot also put up a really interesting post today talking about clarity, which they did cover a little bit in the Lolpls video, so I'm not going to take too much of a dive into it, but it's super interesting deep dive into sort of how Riot designed champions and particles and animations even to make it so that they always stand out and they're very obvious exactly who's who and what they're doing. I've noticed for years how easy it is to tell at a glance which characters are on screen because Riot are super good at creating those distinct silhouettes. So it's definitely a good read. I will have a link down in the description if you guys do want to check that out. I did find it interesting to hear the tidbit about Lee Sin. I really didn't think Lee Sin was that problematic of a character, but I would definitely love to see if Riot do eventually visually rework him, what they do to give him more of a read in a way that still maintains him as sort of the, the blind monk, this sort of just general guy who's going to beat you down with his fists and also who is blind, right? I would love to see what they end up doing with that in the future. Finally, they talk a little bit about Space Groove, which is absolutely buck wild to me, especially given that Demacia Vice didn't do well at all, right? Basically said, yeah, that skin line did not do us so hot, so we're going to be trying to do something differently instead. Space Groove is not really my cup of tea, but hey, I hope it does well, because I do like having slightly wacky things in League to break up the monotony of super serious skins and super serious champions. Also, Isolde is likely our next champion, and she's getting a Space Groove skin, which is super weird. She's also a top lane skirmisher, which I do think is interesting. I thought she was supposed to be a juggernaut, so not sure how I feel about that, especially given that we just got Viego, who is a bit of a skirmisher himself, but I guess we'll kind of see where Riot do decide to go with that. But interesting to see their sort of thought process on Space Groove in the first place, so I do really like that. Finally, talking about legendary skin candidates, not many surprises here. Riot really want to focus their efforts on champions with broad popularity. To use me as an example, I would buy a Kled legendary or a Garen legendary, but since Garen is more likely to appeal to more people, it sort of makes sense for Riot to then make the Garen one, because I'll buy that one too, and a lot of other people that wouldn't buy the Kled one will also buy the Garen one, right? To use that as sort of an example. I also do like that they try to diversify the skin thematic types, but they don't take into account previous legendary or ultimate skins. I think that makes sense given that Riot aren't in the business of giving every character a legendary or ultimate skin. Instead, they're just trying to make sure the legendaries and ultimate skins that they make are, generally speaking, a good thematic and a good fit for characters as a whole. So I did sort of like reading into that. And that's going to be it for me today, guys. Bit of a long post, but I do hope you guys enjoyed the sort of deep dive into Riot's post for today. Let me know what you thought of any of that down in the comment section below. Would love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like. And if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.